In the 1970s, he made his name with an explosive book that turned evolutionary thinking on its head.
It was a wonderful and radical new vision set out in sparkling prose, and above it all, this wonderful, wonderful metaphor, the selfish gene.
The book propelled him into the spotlight and gave Dawkins a platform to speak out as a ferocious critic of religion.
Lord Jakobowicz is an educated man. He knows perfectly well the world was not created in 6 days.
Richard gives definitive answers to things. If you don't like those answers, you're going to find it controversial, you're not going to like him.
Sir, there could be many things that you know well, but please, in the process of it, don't be arrogant.
I try to emphasize that science is magical in the best sense of being spellbinding, spine-crawling, exciting, magical in that sense.
His thinking is defined by logic and by an insistence on scientific evidence.
To say, I don't understand X, therefore it must be magic, or therefore it must be supernatural, it must be a miracle, that's cowardly and defeatist, lazy, and I try to rather strongly make the case against that.
The title Richard chose was The Selfish Gene.
I call the book The Selfish Gene because if anything is a selfish entity maximizing its own survival, it is the gene. You don't want to talk about the selfish organism, the selfish individual, because most of the time, not most of the time, a good bit of the time, organisms are being altruistic. They're driven to be altruistic by the selfish genes.
It was this now iconic title that appealed to publisher Michael Rogers at Oxford University Press.
So Michael asked if he could see what I was working on, and I gave him some chapters. And I was phoned up and he said, I must have that book. And he then, nothing would deter him. I mean, it was absolutely, it was sort of, I don't know what you'd call him, like a...
The book was a huge success. Dawkins' gift for distilling ideas and communicating them had come together in one seminal piece of work.
It gave a radically new view of the world. It was a view that we are just vehicles for our genes. It's the genes' interests that matters. It's not us. And that, he showed, has all sorts of unintended consequences for the way in which we think, new consequences for the way in which we view human behavior. And it was a wonderful and radical new vision set out in sparkling prose, and above it all, this wonderful, wonderful metaphor, the selfish gene.
It revealed the logic with crystal clear precision, and that enabled people to see why natural selection must be gene-centered, why it doesn't make sense to talk about it in any other way.
Richard was, in a way, taking ideas that existed, but making us look at them in a different way, viewing them through a different window, through the window of the selfish gene. It was just the beauty of the way he expressed the ideas was absolutely riveting and, I thought, overwhelming for me, captivating, as somebody who knew a lot about the ideas but hadn't really seen them expressed in exactly that way before.
It's stunningly right, it's stunningly clear, it is the most extraordinary book.
Let's go back a long time ago, and we have man number 1 with wife number 1, and man number 2 with wife number 2. Now, man number 1 decides that he's going to cheat on his wife, and man number 2 decides that he's not going to cheat. So let's say they both have 2 kids each with their wives, but man number 1 also cheated with 3 other women and has a kid with each. That gives the cheater a total of 5 kids with his genes, and the non-cheater a total of only 2. Now, let's say a few lions get hungry and attack and eat 2 kids of each of the men. The genes of man number 2, the honest non-cheater, will not survive, while the genes of man number 1, the dishonest cheater, will go on. This is the main idea of the selfish gene. If there's a gene that's not selfish, it will disappear over time. The cheat on your wife genes will go on, and the don't cheat on your wife genes will go extinct. Let's look at another example. What if you're walking home to your family and you come across an empty hut? The people who own the hut are out gathering food, but they've left the hut all by itself, and you see that there's food in there. And you know you're not going to get caught if you go in and steal all the food. Are you going to be selfish and steal, or are you going to be a good guy? Well, let's look at it in terms of man number 1 and man number 2 again. Man number 2 decides to be honest again and goes home with what he has. On the other hand, man number 1 goes in and steals everything, adds it to everything else he has gathered, and brings home twice as much food. Now famine strikes. Both families of man number 1 and man number 2 are struggling to feed themselves, but man number 1 has twice as much food because he was selfish. Man number 2's family ends up starving to death, and man number 1 struggles to feed his family, but they eventually survive and reproduce. Again, we end up with the selfish genes surviving while the honest genes disappear. Now you might be asking, well, what about all the nice things we do for each other? What about all those altruistic genes? So let me give you an example of that. I have 2 brothers. If someone were to take a gun and tell my mom that she had to choose between the 3 of us dying or her own death, I have almost full certainty that she would pick her own death. So how does that work then? Where's the selfish gene there? A selfish gene is obviously not going to want that, right? Well, let's actually take a closer look. My mom's over 50 now, so she's not going to be reproducing anymore. She does have 3 sons, however, who are all capable of reproducing. So the decision is between absolutely no chance of reproduction or a very high chance of reproduction and survival, considering 3 healthy sons. Keeping this in mind, it now makes perfect sense for a gene to be selfish and want my mom to sacrifice herself. She's not going to sacrifice herself for any random 3 brothers. Why not? It's not like we're the best 3 brothers in the world. What's the difference? The difference is that they don't carry her genes. So the selfish genes logic is very clear here. When you're a 50-year-old woman and you have 3 sons, it makes absolutely perfect sense to pick your own death over the death of your 3 sons. Let's look at another example. Worker bees will sting an intruder and kill it, but in the process the bee's internal organs are ripped out and it dies as well. Wow, now that can't be because of a selfish gene, right? We love looking at social insects like bees and ants and glorifying them for these selfless acts. But let's take a closer look at this kamikaze behavior. What you have to keep in mind is that the bee is sterile. There are 2 ways to help your genes survive. 1, to produce offspring. 2, to take care of and protect the organisms with the same genes as you. Well, since the bee is sterile and cannot produce its own offspring, it now makes perfect sense to kill itself for the organisms which do carry its genes. Dawkins says, the death of a single sterile worker bee is no more serious to its genes than is the shedding of a leaf in autumn to the genes of a tree. So now that
The book was immensely popular, but it also came in for heavy criticism. Some biologists argued that the selfish gene was wrong because genes do not code for any specific characteristics of an organism.
There is no one-to-one correlation between any gene and any bit of how an organism actually operates. Many genes are involved in the expression of any feature in the organism, and each gene is involved in many, many different aspects of how an organism is. And once you don't have that one-to-one correlation, it cannot be that the gene is the unit of selection in this sort of way.
I have never, ever suggested a sort of atomistic relationship between genes and the actual form of the body and the behavior of the body and what it does. complete nonsense, and I never said it, and I certainly don't think it and never did think it. My emphasis on genes is strictly an evolutionary emphasis, that the gene is the level in the hierarchy of life at which natural selection acts. It is the gene which survives or doesn't survive. That's my emphasis on the gene.
But the debate around the selfish gene goes beyond the argument about what genes specifically code for. Richard Dawkins' critics claim that his ideas reduce human beings to mindless agents controlled by our genes.
You can't say, as Dawkins did in The Selfish Gene, that organisms are simply lumbering robots, passive vehicles, whose only function is to help a gene transmit itself into the next generation. This gene-centered, gene metaphor way of describing the world is what I would call genetic determinism, what many people call genetic determinism.
Genetic determinism is the notion that if there is, in quotes, a gene for altruism or another gene for another kind of behavior, somehow that means that the genes determine everything in our bodies and the way we are, and we have no liberty to change things, no free will.
Extremist groups like the National Front perpetuated the notion of racial purity. They seized on the selfish gene as an intellectual defense of their ideas.
A warm review appeared in the journal published by the National Front.
One result of kin selection is a tendency to identify with individuals physically resembling oneself and to be nasty to individuals different in appearance.
Dawkins hit back against what he saw as the political hijacking of his work.
Some people completely misunderstood what's implied by a book I wrote called The Selfish Gene. On the right, we had various writers from the National Front and French equivalents who saw the idea of the selfish gene as chiming in very much with their own rather nasty political philosophy. On the left, on the other hand, I remember being blamed in a magazine article by one influential left-wing writer, almost personally blamed for the election of Mrs. Thatcher in the last general election.
Though the selfish gene was conceived in the halcyon days of the 60s, it hit the zeitgeist in the 80s. Many still see it as a justification for a greedy, self-serving society.
During the 1980s, Thatcherism, free market economics, what I call selfish capitalism, was in urgent need of some kind of profound intellectual justification, a deeper argument to justify it. And it's interesting that The Selfish Gene didn't become a best-selling book, one that was read widely by the public rather than just by a few academics, until the 1980s. During that time, it was interpreted as suggesting that it's natural to be selfish, that it seemed to be a justification for the idea that greed is good.
When Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society, they're only individuals and families, she was, if you like, endorsing the claim of the gene myth, that what matters is not the social organisation in which we're embedded, what matters is actually only the individuals, their genes and their genetic relationships.
We're not completely naive about all of this. Let's make one thing clear. Of course, the gene doesn't have some little brain in it that knows what to do to survive. The primitive woman didn't have a sophisticated understanding of statistics when she decided if it was a good idea to sacrifice herself or her kids. This is all just based on what they do, but what they do turns out to be evolutionarily advantageous, and therefore, through natural selection, they survive. That's it. Alright, now, what is the conclusion for all of this? Well, that our genes are selfish, otherwise we wouldn't be here, and that we're simply vehicles for these genes to transport themselves into the future, and they have no problem throwing us away once we're no longer of use to them. And of course, this is not the happiest conclusion to arrive at. And it makes a lot of people angry. People get angry at the book and Dawkins himself. Is this what you want, Dawkins? Social Darwinism? Is that what you want? I mean, some people are probably angry even at this video, but neither Dawkins nor I want to live in a society that's governed by social Darwinism. We're just simply presenting factual information. Doesn't matter if you like the fact that a husband who will cheat as many times as he can will have a better chance of spreading his genes. That's just a fact. But how can we approach this?
People have used it and taken it as a philosophical justification for extreme right-wing politics. What is your answer to that?
To the extent that natural selection is politically unpleasant, which it actually rather is. I mean, if you were to live your life as though you were constantly aiming for Darwinian success, then the political world which that would result in would be a very unpleasant world, with the strong oppressing the downtrodden. We can emancipate ourselves politically by saying, I want to live in a kind of society which is very far from Darwinian natural selection. I'm a passionate Darwinian who believes that it's Darwinian natural selection that's given us our bodies and our brains. But I also believe that our brains have become big enough that we can rebel against that.
Although the book argues this case, Dawkins has never entirely rid himself of the accusation that his book was a defense of selfishness.
It is a lesson that sometimes people will read a book by title only and omit to read the rather large footnote, which is the book itself. The book could have been called something like The Selfish Gene and the Altruistic Individual, or even just The Altruistic Individual. That would have been a bit long.
Do you think if you'd have called it something else, we'd still be talking about it 35 years later?
I like to think that the book itself has certain merits which might have caused it to be being talked about. Yes, I think I'm kind of talking myself round to thinking perhaps that the title was a mistake.